The morning of January 14th, 1988, in Springfield, Massachusetts, was silent. The cold pressed down like a weight no one could lift, snow blanketing the streets and woods in a suffocating stillness. Vernon Hicks had set out on his routine snowmobile ride, expecting nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of winter solitude. But as his eyes scanned the muted landscape, a flash of red tore through the monochrome world. A wool mitten snagged on the low branch of a brittle oak. At first, it seemed almost out of place, trivial, but Vernon felt a gut punch, a shiver that had nothing to do with the frost. He followed the trail, each step crunching in the powdery snow, until the forest floor opened into a clearing. And there, frozen in a grotesque tableau, lay Robert Hutson. His body was rigid, every muscle caught mid-struggle, as if the winter itself had conspired to preserve the horror. His leather jacket was shredded in places, the fabric sliced and torn, telling a story of desperation. His wrists were bound tightly with frayed, orange extension cords, household items transformed into instruments of violence. His face was locked in terror, a shattered jaw frozen in a silent scream. The defensive wounds on his forearms told of a fight that had been brutally cut short. Vernon's hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, calling the authorities with a voice that trembled more from shock than the cold. Neighbors would later describe the scene as surreal. The forest itself a mute witness to the cruelty inflicted on a man whose only crime had been walking home that night. The snow reflected the early sunlight, glittering almost mockingly over the horror that it refused to hide. Before we continue into the depths of this story, it's important to pause. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. The image of Robert, alone and defeated, would sear itself into the minds of all who heard about it. His life, once ordinary, was now a cautionary nightmare, a brutal interruption that demanded answers. And in Springfield, that winter morning would forever be remembered not for its frost, but for the violence that had silently entered their midst. The news spread like wildfire through Springfield, cutting through the quiet of a winter morning. Every neighbor, every passerby, felt the chill of fear that had nothing to do with snow or ice. Robert Hutson's death wasn't just a headline, it was a mirror reflecting the fragility of life in a town that had believed it was safe. Parents clutched their children tighter. Strangers looked over their shoulders on familiar streets. The brutality was personal, as if the violence had crept into every home and left a mark on the soul of the city itself. Anger rippled through the community. How could someone, a man like Robert, with a steady life, a job he loved, and a fiancée who adored him, be so violently taken? People demanded justice, but the streets offered no answers, only whispers of the horror lying in the frozen woods. Each story of the man in the woods grew heavier with speculation. Who could commit such cruelty? Why him? The questions circled endlessly, a constant drumbeat of outrage and fear. Detectives arrived, their faces masks of professionalism, but even they could not hide the weight of the scene from their eyes. The town, too, carried its own invisible scars. Every glance toward the woods was hesitant. Every passing siren, a reminder that danger could be closer than anyone imagined. Robert's death had turned Springfield into a city that paused to question its own safety, where every quiet moment was haunted by the memory of a man who had fought desperately and lost. And while anger burned in hearts across the city, a profound sadness settled too, the kind that lingers long after the news fades, a grief that binds a community together in shock, in outrage, and in a shared demand for the truth. Quick confession before we go on. My wife said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel before Saturday. She even laughed at me. Laughed. Please don't let her have this victory. Hit that subscribe button, it's free, and help me walk into the living room like a champion. Robert Hutson wasn't just a name on a police report. He was the steady heartbeat of the life he had built. At 33, he had a quiet reliability that earned the respect of everyone who knew him. As a senior draftsman at a downtown architectural firm, his hands shaped skylines and visions, Yet those same hands had fought in vain to save his own life that night. His colleagues remembered a man who always kept his word, who sketched with precision and cared deeply for the details others overlooked. At home, Robert shared a life filled with small, meaningful routines. His fiancée, Vivian Sterling, recalled evenings spent in quiet conversation, their laughter weaving a fragile safety around them both. He left a sweater draped over the back of a chair, a simple gesture now steeped in absence and grief. Those small habits, once mundane, became echoes of a life violently interrupted. Even his nights, seemingly ordinary, held hints of quiet rebellion. Occasional poker games at the Silver Grill gave him a temporary escape, a way to gamble harmlessly and connect with friends. But those small indulgences now seemed to have drawn a line toward tragedy. The ordinary rhythms of his life collided with extraordinary violence, and in that collision, the full weight of his loss struck the city. The contrast was cruel. A man so ordinary, so careful, left in the woods in a state of raw terror, a body bound and broken. Robert Hutson's life demanded recognition before the story unfolded, so that viewers could feel the depth of loss, the magnitude of the injustice, and the anger that would pulse through Springfield for decades to come. Decades passed, and the chilling image of Robert Hutson in the frozen woods became a ghost haunting Springfield's memory. 36 years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights for his fiancée, and a city that had quietly carried the weight of injustice. Then, in 2019, the quiet shattered. A new DNA test, using technology that the investigators of 1988 could only dream of, produced a breakthrough. The cold case file that had gathered dust was suddenly alive with the possibility of justice. News of the arrest rippled through the community like lightning. The man being taken into custody wasn't a stranger or a transient. He was someone from Springfield, someone who had lived among them, hidden behind ordinary smiles and the appearance of respectability. Shock mingled with disbelief. Anger surged anew, sharper and colder than the winter air that had once claimed Robert. Neighbors, friends, and those who had long mourned silently found themselves facing the past all over again. Conversations that had ended in whispered fears now erupted in tension-filled debates. Questions resurfaced. Could this be the person responsible? How did he evade justice for so long? The arrest reopened wounds that had never healed, forcing the city to confront the painful truth. Time could not erase terror, and it could not shield a killer from exposure forever. And there it was, the revelation that turned grief into outrage, sorrow into anticipation. The name behind the arrest was the last person anyone expected. A community that had lived in uneasy peace now faced the unthinkable. And the story of Robert Hutson's death would finally demand its reckoning. The snow lay heavy over Springfield that January morning, muffling the city in a deceptive calm. Vernon Hicks, on his weekend ride through the frozen outskirts, expected nothing more than the crisp air and the quiet crunch of his snowmobile against packed snow. That expectation shattered the moment his eyes caught the glint of red snagged on a brittle oak branch. A wool mitten, bright and impossible, against the stark white of the woods. Something in its placement felt wrong, instinctively alarming, though he didn't yet understand why. As he nudged the snowmobile closer, each footstep sank into the fresh powder, disturbing the silence like a whisper in a cathedral. The air felt thicker here, colder somehow, pressing against him, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Vernon's curiosity wrestled with a rising dread as he moved deeper, following a faint trail toward the unknown. Then, in a small clearing, the nightmare revealed itself. Robert Hutson lay sprawled across the frozen ground, a man whose life had been violently interrupted. His leather jacket was torn, shredded in places, the fabric a mute testimony to the struggle he had endured. The orange extension cords binding his wrists twisted in the snow, ordinary tools transformed into cruel instruments. His face was locked in a final, silent scream, eyes wide in horror, jaw shattered. Defensive wounds marked his forearms, each a desperate plea that had gone unanswered. The forest was silent, yet the air seemed heavy with the echo of a struggle that had ended too soon. Vernon stumbled back, hands trembling, the weight of what he had seen pressing down. Every instinct screamed to run, to call for help, to reject the reality before him. And yet he could not turn away. The body demanded attention, demanded witness. Robert Hutson's body lay in the snow like a cruel statement against innocence, every detail screaming of the violence that had overtaken him. His leather jacket, once a shield against the cold, was shredded, ripped open as if the winter itself had witnessed the brutality. The bright orange extension cords coiled around his wrists were a stark, almost grotesque contrast to the whiteness surrounding him. A common, domestic object turned into a tool of pain. His face bore the imprint of sheer terror. The shattered jaw, the silent scream frozen mid-air, and the wide, unblinking eyes told a story that words could barely touch. Deep gouges etched across his forearms spoke of a desperate, protracted struggle. A man unwilling to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming force. Every crease of his clothing, every trace of movement captured in the frozen snow, spoke of a final battle fought in vain. The cold held him in suspended agony, preserving the moment with horrifying clarity. Each flake of snow that landed on the scene felt like a muted witness to the crime, silently testifying to a violence that the town could neither understand nor immediately contain. The silence pressed down, making every sound the crunch of the snow underfoot, the distant hum of a siren feel amplified, intrusive against the frozen stillness of death. It was impossible to look away. The scene demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement of the brutality Robert had endured. The forest, once an ordinary backdrop to winter walks and snowmobile rides, had transformed into a stage for a tragedy that would haunt Springfield for decades. The frozen tableau was more than a body in the snow. It was a declaration, a record of suffering, and a grim foreshadowing of the dark truths yet to be uncovered. The call crackled over the radio, piercing the quiet of the winter morning. Officers and emergency responders raced toward the woods, unaware that the scene awaiting them would test their composure in ways few could imagine. As they approached the clearing, the first sight of Robert Hutson's body stopped them cold. The cold air, the snow-dusted ground, and the twisted orange cords made the horror tangible, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Detective Elias Thorne, newly assigned and already weighed down by the responsibility of the case, stepped carefully into the clearing. Every movement was deliberate, yet his pulse raced. He had seen death before, but nothing like this. The meticulous violence, the shattered jaw, the defensive wounds, they were markers of a struggle that had ended brutally. A man who had fought to survive and failed. The forest, silent and indifferent, seemed almost to mock their presence. Paramedics checked for signs of life, though no one expected to find any. Their hands shook as they worked methodically, documenting, photographing, and preserving the scene. Each detail, the torn jacket, the frayed extension cords, the footprints in the snow, was catalogued, yet the enormity of the act hung heavy over them. A deep, collective unease settled in the team. Even the seasoned officers, hardened by years on the streets, felt an unusual chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Voices were hushed, commands were clipped. Shock mingled with a rising anger at the cruelty inflicted on a man who had done nothing to deserve it. The first responders could sense that this was more than a violent attack. It was a calculated, personal act, a message left in the snow. And as the winter morning stretched on, the weight of that realization settled over Springfield like an unshakable frost, leaving everyone who saw it changed forever. By midday, the news of Robert Hutson's death had spread through Springfield like wildfire. The small town, usually quiet under its winter blanket, now pulsed with shock and fear. Families huddled in homes, neighbors whispered along snow-dusted streets, and even routine errands carried an edge of tension. The brutality of the crime penetrated every corner. People felt the weight of violence that had arrived unannounced, in a place they once considered safe. Anger coursed through the community. How could a man like Robert, known for his steadiness and quiet kindness, be taken so violently? Conversations carried disbelief, frustration, and whispered accusations. Every glance into the woods, Every shadow along familiar paths carried the specter of what had occurred. People questioned the security of their streets, the judgment of their neighbors, and the fragility of life itself. For those who had known Robert personally, grief was immediate and consuming. His fiancée, Vivian Sterling, sat in her home holding the sweater he had left behind, each thread a memory now laced with sorrow. Colleagues at the architectural firm spoke in muted tones, struggling to reconcile the man who drafted skylines with the victim frozen in a clearing. Even those who had only seen him in passing felt the weight of his absence, the silence he left behind. The town's innocence, fragile and unquestioned until that morning, fractured completely. Fear and anger intertwined, binding the community in a shared sense of urgency. Questions loomed large. Who could commit such cruelty? And why? The answer was not yet visible, but the impact was undeniable. Springfield would never feel the same. The image of Robert in the snow would remain, haunting every quiet street and echoing through the hearts of those who had lived through that winter morning. Even as Springfield struggled to process the horror, Detective Thorne felt a deeper, colder truth settling in. This was no random act of violence. The choice of location, the binding cords, the intensity of the struggle, it all pointed to intention, to design. Robert Hutson had not simply been attacked. He had been sent a message, one that whispered through the snow, echoed in the trees, and imprinted itself on the minds of all who saw him. And though no one could yet decipher its meaning, the realization pressed on the town like an unyielding winter. The terror had a purpose. Robert Hutson's life was defined by routine, reliability, and quiet precision. As a senior draftsman at a respected architectural firm downtown, his days were filled with sketches, blueprints, and designs that shaped the skyline. His colleagues trusted him implicitly, knowing that every line he drew was measured, deliberate, and exact. Yet Robert's dedication to work never overshadowed his warmth. He was the quiet backbone of his office, the man who remembered birthdays, offered a kind word, and kept a steady calm amid the chaos of deadlines. At home, his life was equally structured. He lived in a modest two-story colonial, surrounded by the comfort of familiar streets lined with old-growth maples. His mornings were predictable. Coffee brewed just so, the newspaper folded neatly, and the sweater he liked draped over a chair ready for him. Small, ordinary acts became intimate details of a life lived, thoughtfully watering the plants, feeding his cat, checking on neighbors during winter storms. These routines grounded him, offering stability in a world that often felt uncertain. Robert's habits extended to hobbies and quiet escapes. He occasionally played low-stakes poker at the Silver Grill, a local diner where friends and acquaintances gathered. And on weekends, he enjoyed walks through nearby parks, taking mental snapshots of the city's changing skyline. Even these simple pleasures were infused with his careful nature. He never hurried, never rushed, always observing, always attentive. Through every interaction, every choice, Robert left a subtle imprint on those around him. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but he mattered. And it was precisely this ordinariness, this decency, that made the violent disruption of his life so incomprehensible, so devastating, leaving a void that would echo through Springfield for decades. Beyond the routines and sketches, Robert Hutson harbored quiet dreams that few truly knew. He imagined a life filled with travel, perhaps sketching distant skylines from sunlit rooftops far beyond Springfield. He spoke little of these desires, sharing them only with Vivian Sterling, his fiancée, whose laughter and literary insight grounded him in the world. Their conversations often meandered from poetry to architecture, from shared memories to whispered hopes, creating a small universe in which Robert felt entirely understood. Friends described him as a man who listened more than he spoke, yet every word carried thoughtfulness and care. He remembered details others overlooked: a neighbor's birthday, a colleague's promotion, a friend's quiet hardship. These gestures, though subtle, revealed a man invested in those around him, attentive to their lives as much as to his own. His kindness was a constant, almost invisible thread, weaving him into the fabric of the community without fanfare. Robert also found solace in moments of solitude, sketching city streets at twilight, or enjoying a quiet evening at home with a book and a warm drink. These moments, ordinary to the outside world, were essential to him, a counterbalance to the responsibilities and pressures of work. They revealed a man who valued life's small joys as deeply as its milestones. Even in social spaces, his presence was steady, comforting. At the local diner or among poker friends, Robert's calm demeanor and quiet wit drew people to him, though he never sought attention. The ordinary grace of his life, the consistency of his character, made the tragedy that would strike him even more unbearable. His death was not just the loss of a man, it was the shattering of a life built on care, trust, and the kind of small, meaningful connections that define humanity. The night Robert Hutson walked into the Brass Rail, he carried none of the suspicion that would later haunt the town. The bar, dimly lit and warm against the biting January air, was familiar territory, a place where faces were known, conversations flowed easily, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world could be set aside. Robert's laughter mingled with the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses punctuating the ordinary rhythm of an evening that would never be ordinary again. He ordered his usual drink, exchanging polite words with the bartender, acknowledging acquaintances with nods and brief smiles. No one could have guessed that these mundane gestures were the final marks of a life on the brink. Robert's attention was split between conversation and the anticipation of a small celebration, a minor victory in his poker games that he intended to mention quietly to his friends. The ordinary nature of the night, its harmlessness, made the shadow waiting outside all the more horrifying. Robert left the bar just before midnight, heading toward his car with a sense of routine that would soon be shattered. A witness, fleeting and frightened, noticed a hulking truck nearby, the silhouette of a figure moving silently in the cold. Robert, unaware of the danger, walked into a trap that had been set with precision. Every step, every choice, was ordinary, yet it led him inexorably toward a violent confrontation. By the time he reached the woods, the evening's laughter, small victories, and quiet routines were gone. He was confronted by forces he could neither predict nor overpower. What began as a celebration of life became an instantaneous, brutal struggle. Robert fought, resisted, but the odds were against him. His final moments were a battle of strength and fear, a desperate, unseen struggle that would leave him bound, broken, and ultimately silenced in the frozen snow of Springfield. Even in his ordinary life, subtle shadows hinted at Robert's hidden struggles. A few poker nights at the Silver Grill had led to minor debts, and his casual conversations sometimes carried an unspoken tension. Friends noticed fleeting moments of unease, a hesitation in his eyes, a brief defensiveness over small questions. Nothing seemed alarming at the time, just ordinary human worries, but in hindsight, these fragments became threads that, when woven together, whispered of a private world Robert had shielded from everyone. It was a quiet complexity, a hint that the man everyone admired carried burdens that only fate would soon expose. Robert Hutson had always been a man who balanced precision with quiet indulgence. One of his few escapes from the daily grind of drafting blueprints was the low-stakes poker games held in the dimly lit basement of the Silver Grill. It was a place where locals gathered, mechanics, small business owners, and a handful of quiet opportunists, all looking for a chance to test their luck and skill. The air hummed with chatter, the shuffling of cards, and the occasional clink of coins on worn wooden tables. For Robert, the games were never about greed. He enjoyed the strategy, the subtle reading of opponents, the fleeting camaraderie, and the distraction from the rigid patterns of his life. His calm, methodical approach often gave him an edge, and while he celebrated small victories modestly, they did not go unnoticed by the regulars. The other players began to see him as clever, cautious, and unexpectedly formidable. It was in these small wins and losses, in the laughter and frustration around the table, that Robert allowed himself a brief taste of thrill, a contrast to the quiet, orderly life he led by day. Yet even in this seemingly harmless pastime, the stakes were higher than they appeared. Among the regulars were men whose tempers were quick, whose debts were grudgingly repaid, and whose pride could not bear defeat. Robert, careful though he was, did not fully grasp the subtle power dynamics he had entered. Every hand played, every chip won or lost, began to weave threads that would pull him into a dangerous web, one that would eventually entangle him far beyond the basement walls of the diner. The games, light-hearted in appearance, hid tensions that would soon erupt into something deadly. What began as casual poker games soon drew Robert into a subtle danger he had never anticipated. On one particular night, a series of losses left him slightly overextended. He had borrowed a small sum from a local player to cover his shortfall, a seemingly innocent decision, meant only to smooth over a minor inconvenience. But this was not an ordinary player. The man he had borrowed from was known in whispered circles, a presence that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His patience was short, his memory long, and the consequences of crossing him were not forgiving. The borrowed money, though modest in amount, became a symbol of Robert's vulnerability. He found himself making careful calculations, balancing obligations against an increasing unease that something larger was at play. Casual conversations turned cautious. He noticed glances that lingered too long, and remarks weighted with subtle reminders of hierarchy and power. The social dynamics of the poker table had shifted. The camaraderie was gone, replaced by tension and the silent assertion of control. Every decision now carried risk. Robert understood that he had unknowingly stepped into a world where debts were not only financial, they were moral, symbolic, a test of respect and survival. The small error of borrowing from the wrong man became an invisible chain tightening around him. The warmth of the diner basement, once a refuge, now felt stifling, fraught with eyes that weighed and judged. Every victory felt tainted by the threat hovering above him. It was in these nights of quiet tension that Robert's ordinary life began to fracture. Unseen and unanticipated, the danger had already marked him, drawing a line that would inevitably lead to confrontation. The shadow of the man he had crossed loomed large, and Robert had no idea how close it already was. Victor Albright was a man whose presence was felt long before he spoke. He moved through Springfield with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, respected, and feared in equal measure. People noticed his broad shoulders, the sharpness in his gaze, and the stillness that suggested a readiness to act at a moment's notice. He did not boast, did not gesture unnecessarily, and yet his silence carried more weight than the words of most men. In the world of low-stakes poker, where tempers flared and debts were collected casually, Victor was an entirely different caliber, a storm contained within a man. Robert had heard the whispers, the soft warnings exchanged over the poker table. Victor's reputation as a man who demanded respect and repaid grievances with force was not exaggeration. The notion of crossing him, even unintentionally, had consequences that were immediate and unrelenting. Robert's small victory in a recent game, a substantial win against Victor himself, had gone unnoticed by no one. The air of tension thickened in the diner basement as Victor's presence loomed over conversations, his eyes tracking, assessing, waiting. Unlike the others, Victor did not display anger or panic. His approach was calculated, patient, and unyielding. It was in this quiet observation that the threat became undeniable. Robert, usually confident and composed, began to feel the weight of scrutiny, the subtle, mounting fear of a man who had stepped into a world far beyond ordinary boundaries. Every decision, every casual gesture, was now under Victor's watchful eye. Robert understood, too late, that the stakes were no longer about cards or money. They were about survival, respect, and the unspoken rules of a man whose patience was finite and whose retribution was inevitable. The shadow of Victor Albright was now a constant, and it would follow Robert long after the basement's fluorescent lights faded. Robert Hutson's debt was no longer a simple financial obligation. Each day, it became a weight pressing on his chest, a reminder that a small misstep could unravel everything. The poker winnings, once a source of quiet pride, now cast a long shadow. Victor Albright's silent presence haunted him, not openly confrontational, but impossible to ignore. Every glance from Victor, every hushed conversation overheard, seemed to amplify the danger Robert faced. The debt was more than money. It had become a measure of power, control, and an unspoken warning that some mistakes cannot be forgiven. As tensions escalated, Robert began to retreat into himself. Friends noticed a change, the subtle withdrawal, the fleeting looks of worry, the brief pauses in conversation where his mind seemed elsewhere. He understood that he was now trapped in a system of intimidation he had never intended to enter. The air in Springfield, already bitter with winter cold, seemed heavier, charged with an invisible menace. Even mundane trips outside, once familiar, now carried a sense of unease, a reminder that Victor's reach extended beyond the poker table. It was during this period of mounting tension that the stakes became painfully personal. Robert's pride, his autonomy, and his very sense of safety were under threat. The debt had transformed from a simple transaction into a symbol of dominance, a silent claim over his life. Each interaction with Victor, every minor remark or glance, reinforced the idea that he was no longer in control. Before we move forward, take a moment and consider. If someone you trusted wielded power over your life quietly, invisibly, would you see it coming in time? If you want to uncover how this hidden tension exploded into tragedy, subscribe and stay with us. You won't want to miss the shocking turns ahead. Robert Hutson could feel the shadow closing in. Every casual walk, every brief conversation, now carried the weight of unspoken danger. Victor Albright's presence, though quiet, was relentless, a constant reminder that mistakes had consequences far beyond money or pride. The ordinary world Robert knew had narrowed into a corridor of tension, where each step could provoke a violent outcome. He had entered a game he could no longer control, and the threat he faced was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, and unstoppable. The first cracks in his life were showing, and the consequences would be devastating. In 1988, Duncan Albright was 18, a young man teetering between adolescence and adulthood, carrying the weight of expectations he could barely understand. Living in the shadow of his father, Victor, he absorbed lessons in authority and intimidation without fully grasping their nuance. Every action, every choice, seemed to be measured against a silent standard, approval or disapproval from the man whose presence dominated their household. Duncan's desire to impress, to prove himself capable and fearless, often collided with his own insecurity, leaving him both anxious and volatile. At school, he was neither the star athlete nor the top student. He moved through the world quietly, watching others and learning when to speak and when to retreat. In the Albright household, however, silence was often mistaken for weakness, and Duncan quickly learned that anger could demand attention in a way that meekness never would. The volatility that simmered beneath his calm exterior became both a shield and a weapon, shaping how he navigated friendships, rivalries, and his limited independence. Duncan's social life was confined mostly to the familiar faces of Springfield's small circles, including those he would eventually encounter in poker games. He was observant, quietly competitive, and painfully aware of his position in the social hierarchy. Every glance at a successful peer, every minor victory he witnessed others achieve, seemed to ignite both admiration and envy. It was in these formative months that the tension between caution and impulsivity began to define him. A young man whose ambition was fueled by insecurity, whose temper hinted at violence he could not yet control. By the time winter of 1988 arrived, Duncan's life was a delicate balancing act. Eager to impress his father, aware of his own limitations, and silently nursing a grudging resentment toward anyone who seemed to surpass him, the stage was quietly set for conflict. Duncan Albright carried his father's shadow in more ways than one. Victor's reputation for control and intimidation loomed over every decision, every action. Yet while Victor wielded his temper with calculated precision, Duncan's was raw, unrefined, and unpredictable. Where his father could silence a room with a glance or a single word, Duncan often lost control in bursts, shouting, lashing out, or letting anger dictate behavior before thought could intervene. It was a dangerous inheritance, a potent energy without the guiding hand that had taught his father to channel it. Friends and classmates had learned to give Duncan space when his temper flared. Minor slights, teasing remarks, or perceived slights could ignite his fury in moments, and he often wrestled internally with guilt or shame afterward. At home, he absorbed lessons in authority and dominance, but his lack of experience made it difficult to temper instinct with strategy. Every encounter became a test of restraint, a battle between the part of him craving approval and the part willing to explode to assert himself. Victor's presence created a paradox. Duncan admired his father's ability to command respect without overreacting, yet he feared his judgment. He wanted to emulate that control, but the weight of expectation and his own unresolved frustration often pushed him toward impulsive actions. Every time he felt powerless, the temper surged, a volatile combination of inherited aggression and youthful insecurity. This duality, admiration for his father's mastery, resentment at his own inability to match it, would later shape Duncan's decisions in ways he could not foresee. The simmering tension, barely contained, was quietly molding a young man who could be dangerous when provoked, unpredictable when pressured, and driven by a need to assert himself in ways both subtle and shocking. Duncan Albright's interactions with Robert Hutson were a mixture of envy, resentment, and reluctant admiration. At the poker games, Robert's calm demeanor and strategic thinking set him apart, and Duncan could not help but notice how effortlessly he commanded respect without raising his voice. Every small victory Robert achieved, every pot he claimed, was a reminder of Duncan's own limitations and fueled a quiet frustration he struggled to contain. Their encounters were never overtly hostile at first, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Duncan would make sharp, competitive moves at the table, sometimes overreaching, sometimes reacting with visible irritation when Robert bested him. The subtle power dynamics, the way Robert read the room, the way other players deferred to his judgment, ignited a mixture of jealousy and ambition in Duncan. He wanted recognition, and Robert's effortless skill made him feel diminished, spurring feelings that were equal parts admiration and envy. Outside the basement of the Silver Grill, their paths crossed in town, in fleeting conversations and casual nods, always underscored by an unspoken competition. Duncan measured himself against Robert, noting his composure, his intelligence, and the quiet authority he carried despite a life of ordinary routines. Each encounter added layers to Duncan's growing sense of rivalry. This tension, though subtle at first, was slowly becoming more personal. The poker games were no longer mere games. They had evolved into a battlefield of pride and resentment. Duncan's youthful impulsivity clashed with Robert's measured confidence, and the friction between them began to shape thoughts and actions that neither could fully articulate. Beneath the surface of casual rivalry, the seeds of a deadly confrontation were quietly taking root, ready to sprout under the right, or perhaps wrong, circumstances. The tension between Duncan Albright and Robert Hutson had reached a quiet, dangerous apex. Every glance, every minor interaction, carried the weight of unspoken rivalry and growing resentment. Duncan's temper, volatile and untrained, simmered beneath a veneer of composure, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. The night Robert would meet his fate, Duncan's restraint would shatter in a way no one could have foreseen, not his father, not his peers, and certainly not Robert himself. The stage was set, the powder keg waiting silently. One moment would change everything, and the consequences would echo for decades. The night was bitter, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into bones and silence the world around it. The streets of Springfield were empty, lights reflecting off the thin layer of ice that covered sidewalks and roads. In the dim glow of a street lamp near the edge of town, Robert Hutson's path intersected with Duncan Albright's. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken tension, a culmination of months of rivalry and suppressed anger. Words were exchanged, clipped and cautious at first, but each syllable carried the weight of past envy, resentment, and pride. Robert, unaware of the full intensity of Duncan's inner storm, tried to diffuse the tension. His calm voice, reasoned tone, and careful gestures were met with an unpredictability that Robert had never faced. Duncan's fists clenched and unclenched, eyes darting, searching for an outlet for the frustration and rage that had been building for months. The cold wind whipped around them, but it could not compete with the heat of raw emotion spiraling in that small, frozen space. Every glance, every hesitation, escalated the encounter. Duncan's movements grew erratic, his body tight with anticipation, ready to act before thought could guide him. Robert sensed the shift, the danger rising with each passing second, but he had no way to predict the explosive force contained within the young man standing before him. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, Duncan reached for the frayed orange extension cords objects that would transform a heated confrontation into an irreversible act of violence. The stage was set. The winter night, the frozen ground, and the storm of emotions converged into a single, fateful moment. Duncan's hand closed around the frayed orange cords, and with that simple, domestic object, the confrontation tipped into chaos. The surge of anger he had carried for months finally found a vessel. Every thought of inferiority, every pang of envy toward Robert, ignited in a violent, uncontrolled force. He lashed out with desperation. A raw, unfiltered aggression that no training, no experience, could contain. Robert struggled, his body fighting instinctively against the cords that now bound him. His calm, measured demeanor gave way to shock and panic as the situation escalated beyond reasoning. Duncan's strength, fueled by fury and fear, overpowered logic and restraint. Every move was chaotic, a desperate improvisation born from a young man who had never been forced to confront consequences so immediate and severe. The cold winter night became irrelevant as the two men grappled, each movement carrying the weight of months of tension. The cords twisted, hands flailed, and the sounds of struggle, a muffled grunt, a thud, a snap of winter air pierced the quiet streets. Duncan's vision narrowed, focused entirely on the person before him, unable to see past the immediacy of his own emotion. Panic mingled with rage, creating a storm that threatened to consume him entirely. In those frantic moments, the young Albright could not gauge the damage inflicted. Every strike, every pull, was amplified by the intensity of his feelings, yet he lacked the control his father had mastered. By the time the cords slackened and the struggle slowed, the irreversible had begun. Duncan's actions were no longer merely the product of competition or envy. They had become a violent eruption, a destructive force that would mark the beginning of a decades-long nightmare for Springfield and for Robert Hutson. The night's chaos had reached a fevered pitch when Victor Albright appeared at the edge of the scene. His arrival was neither perfectly timed nor completely too late. It hovered in that ambiguous space where timing could change everything. The sight of his son, wild-eyed and trembling, struggling with Robert, sent a sharp jolt through Victor's body. Years of control, intimidation, and silent authority had prepared him for many challenges. But this, the raw, uncontrolled violence of an 18-year-old, was something else entirely. Victor's presence added a new layer of tension. Duncan, already caught in a storm of fury and panic, now felt the weight of his father's gaze. It was a mixture of fear, reverence, and the desperate need for approval. Every move he made seemed amplified, every decision scrutinized in real time. The cords, the struggle, the violence, all became a performance under the watchful eyes of the man whose standards he had spent years trying to meet. Robert, meanwhile, recognized the arrival as both a potential lifeline and a new source of uncertainty. Victor's intervention could either end the immediate threat or exacerbate it. The uncertainty of the father-son dynamic, combined with the chaos of the struggle, created a terrifying unpredictability. Emotions ran high, instincts sharpened, and for a brief, suspended moment, all three men were caught in a fragile, explosive triangle. In the frigid darkness, Duncan's rage collided with Victor's authority, creating a maelstrom that neither fully controlled. The night had become a crucible, forging consequences from impulsive actions and unrestrained emotion. One wrong move, one hesitation, and the fragile line between confrontation and catastrophe would vanish completely. The scene teetered on the edge of irrevocable tragedy, and no one could predict which way it would fall. The moment the struggle subsided, an eerie stillness settled over the frozen clearing. Duncan Albright, chest heaving, hands trembling, finally registered the enormity of what had transpired. The cords lay slack in his grasp, yet the weight of their purpose pressed down with crushing intensity. His mind raced, fragments of impulse and panic colliding with the stark realization. There was no undoing what had happened. Robert Hutson, caught in the aftermath, barely breathed. The fight had drained him, left him vulnerable in ways that words could not capture. Duncan's initial surge of anger began to fracture, replaced by shock and a creeping sense of guilt. Every glance at Robert's still form chipped away at the adrenaline that had fueled his actions, leaving raw fear and despair in its place. Victor's face, a mask of control and hidden fury, only amplified the collapse. Duncan could see both disappointment and warning reflected in his father's eyes. The authority he had sought for so long became an unbearable judgment, magnifying his panic. He understood that approval could no longer be earned through violence or fear. Instead, every instinct screamed that the path forward was uncertain, dangerous, and morally compromised. The cold night pressed in, indifferent to the human tragedy that had just unfolded. Silence enveloped the scene, broken only by Duncan's shallow, uneven breaths. Time seemed suspended, each second stretching into eternity as the magnitude of the act sank into the consciousness of those present. The chaos that had ruled moments before had been replaced by a suffocating stillness, a haunting pause before the inevitable consequences would ripple outward. In that frozen, bitter night, Duncan Albright's world had shattered internally. The thrill of anger and competition had given way to the crushing reality of irreversible choice. No one present could yet comprehend the chain of events that had begun in mere seconds. The night retreated, leaving Springfield under a blanket of ice and quiet. The streets, once familiar, seemed foreign, haunted by a presence no one could yet name. In the woods, the confrontation had ended, but its echoes lingered in the frozen air, thick and oppressive. First responders, summoned hours later, would arrive to a scene that felt almost unreal. A man caught in the final struggle for life, a young boy consumed by panic and guilt, and a silence so absolute it pressed into the soul. Neighbors would later speak of a night broken by a single, distant sound. The crunch of boots over snow, the creak of doors, the muted thrum of emergency vehicles. Each step toward the scene carried a weight heavier than the cold, the dark, or the winter wind. Those who arrived first were not prepared for what met them. Robert Hutson's body, taut with the memory of agony, and Duncan Albright, standing frozen, face pale and hands trembling, a young man confronted with the undeniable consequences of unrestrained emotion. In that silence, the town's innocence fractured. The winter's chill became a metaphor for fear, the unbroken quiet, a mirror of shock. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone to speak, to act, to undo what could not be undone. But there were no words, only the knowledge that something extraordinary and tragic had occurred. And yet, this was not merely an attack. The first responders, the neighbors, the authorities would soon sense it. The positioning, the violence, the particular care in which the scene was left. It was a message, one meant to resonate beyond the moment, to leave an imprint on every observer who would later piece together the fragments of that night. The winter held its secret close, waiting for the decades ahead to reveal the truth. Victor Albright's mind raced as he pieced together the scene, each detail a cold confirmation of what he had feared. His son, Duncan, had crossed a line that could never be undone. The initial shock was immediate, a jolt of disbelief and horror that left him momentarily paralyzed. He had raised his son in a world where strength and control were prized, where missteps could be punished. And yet, here was Duncan, 18 years old, overwhelmed by his own impulses, holding the consequences of an unthinkable act. The father-son dynamic shifted instantly. Victor's paternal instinct collided with the sharp edge of his pragmatic mind. Panic flared briefly, an acknowledgement that the authorities could discover the truth at any moment, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. He understood, with unnerving clarity, that inaction would spell disaster. The boy's life, the family's reputation, and the carefully constructed veneer of respectability were all at stake. Victor approached Duncan with a combination of authority and controlled fear. Every word, every gesture, communicated both reprimand and protection. He had to gauge his son's state, the depth of panic, and the likelihood of error. The realization settled. The situation could be contained, but only if he acted decisively. Every moment wasted risked exposure, yet every step required precision. In that frozen night, Victor made the decision that would define the next decades. He would not let this act define his son or himself in the eyes of the law. The path forward was clear, dark, and unyielding. They would act as one, a pact forged in fear, guilt, and paternal authority. The consequences were enormous, yet the strategy was simple. Conceal, intimidate, control. The life-altering plan had begun, and the first moves were calculated in the shadow of a crime that would haunt them both silently for decades to come. The raw panic that had gripped both father and son moments earlier began to crystallize into a chilling, methodical plan. Victor's mind, sharp and unflinching, assessed every risk, every potential witness, every trace that could link them to Robert Hutson's death. The frenzy in Duncan's eyes mirrored the storm in his own chest, but Victor knew that fear could be harnessed, redirected into obedience and precision. He instructed Duncan with a calm that belied the chaos inside. Each word was deliberate, each command designed to transform panic into action. "We fix this, and we fix it now," he said, voice low and steady, carrying the weight of authority that had governed Duncan's life since childhood. The young Albright, trembling and wide-eyed, followed instructions, guided by a mixture of terror and filial trust. Every hesitation, every flicker of doubt, was met with controlled pressure, forcing him into compliance. The cold night air pressed around them, unnoticed, as plans formed. They reviewed the sequence: remove evidence, silence potential threats, construct a narrative strong enough to mislead investigators. Victor's mind was already calculating contingencies, predicting questions law enforcement might ask, the behaviors witnesses could exhibit, and the gaps they would need to fill. Every detail, from the position of objects to the stories they would tell, was considered. In this transformation from panic to strategy, a dangerous clarity emerged. The initial emotional storm had given way to calculated action, the first step toward building what they would call a perfect secret. Father and son became conspirators, bound not just by blood but by shared knowledge of the crime. The night, once chaotic, now carried the precise and suffocating tension of a plan being executed with cold determination. Victor and Duncan moved with careful urgency, each step measured despite the residual adrenaline coursing through their veins. The frayed orange extension cords, Robert's belongings, any item that could tie them to the crime, were handled with meticulous care. The cold air bit at their fingers, but neither man noticed. The urgency of concealment consumed all attention. Every motion was deliberate, each action calculated to erase the traces of what had occurred. Victor dictated each move, his voice low but unwavering, a mix of command and reassurance. "Everything goes, nothing stays," he instructed, guiding Duncan through the grim task. Fear was now a tool, sharpening focus and compelling precision. They worked swiftly to remove evidence, burying or disposing of anything that could incriminate them. Dirt, snow, and shadows became allies in the creation of an unbroken story, a story that would obscure the violence beneath a veneer of normalcy. Potential witnesses were accounted for, threats carefully implied or delivered to ensure silence. Victor's mind considered every angle: the casual passerby, the late-night commuter, the bar patrons who might recall Robert's last movements. Subtle intimidation was employed, measured so that suspicion would never attach to them, yet fear would settle firmly in the hearts of those who might speak. The narrative was being written not in words, but in absence, absence of evidence, absence of contradiction, absence of truth. By the time the night waned, a perfect secret had begun to take shape. To the outside world, nothing had occurred. The Albrights remained pillars of their community, untainted by the violent truth. Yet inside, the weight of their actions pressed down, shaping the next decades. For Duncan, the burden was already suffocating, his youthful psyche scarred by guilt and the knowledge that the world would never know what he had done. Over the following days, weeks, and months, Victor and Duncan carefully cultivated the narrative that would shield them from suspicion. To Springfield, they were model citizens. Victor, the respected contractor and devoted father. Duncan, the obedient son pursuing work and normalcy. Every public gesture, every conversation, reinforced the image of two men untouched by the violent night in the woods. Their outward composure became a mask, hiding the truth beneath layers of calculated normality. Inside their home, the tension never faded. Every memory of the struggle haunted Duncan, a constant reminder of his unrelenting guilt. Victor, ever vigilant, monitored his son's behavior, ensuring that panic or confession would never disrupt the fragile equilibrium they had created. Together, they orchestrated a life that concealed the crime in plain sight, leaving no cracks for suspicion to seep through. The creation of the perfect secret was both practical and psychological. It involved rewriting routines, controlling interactions, and subtly shaping community perception. The Albrights became untouchable, a household immune to the scrutiny that had haunted countless others in similar circumstances. The evidence, real and tangible, had been buried or destroyed. The narrative, crafted with precision, was airtight. Yet within that illusion, Duncan's mind became a cage, each day amplifying the echo of his actions. Victor's guidance ensured survival, but at the cost of moral decay and perpetual vigilance. Duncan's youth, once a time for learning, exploration, and growth, was replaced with a quiet, simmering torment. He carried the weight of complicity, his father's dominance a constant reminder that secrecy was both shield and shackle. The pair had built more than a story. They had built a fortress around the truth, one that would endure decades, leaving the crime buried in darkness, yet alive in the minds of those who committed it. Duncan Albright carried the weight of that night like a shadow that never lifted. Every decision, every interaction, was quietly haunted by the memory of Robert Hutson's final struggle. Outwardly composed, he blended into the community, yet inside, guilt festered, and guilt consumed him. Panic, shame, and self-recrimination became constant companions, eroding peace over decades. The secret he shared with his father was a silent prison, each passing year reinforcing the walls, and though the world saw a respectable man, the boy who had snapped in 1988 lived on inside, tormented, fractured, and quietly awaiting the truth's eventual reckoning. The first hours after Robert Hutson's body was discovered were chaotic, a blur of cold, adrenaline, and urgency. Detective Elias Thorne and his team arrived at the frozen clearing with a sense of grim duty. Yet the unforgiving winter imposed limits they could not overcome. Snow muffled potential footprints, erased subtle traces of struggle, and obscured anything that might have led to a clearer understanding of the events. What little evidence remained was ordinary in appearance. A frayed orange extension cord, a torn jacket, a scattered mitten but carried with it the silent weight of violence. The initial investigation faced immediate hurdles. Standard forensic techniques of 1,988 were incapable of revealing microscopic biological evidence that might have identified the perpetrator. Witnesses were sparse, recollections vague. The local bar where Robert had last been seen offered few clues, as patrons remembered only fragments. A departing silhouette, laughter, a glass set down on the counter. The neighborhood, tightly knit yet wary, offered polite explanations but withheld suspicion, either out of fear or uncertainty. Procedural mistakes, though unintentional, compounded the challenge. Critical interviews were delayed, notes were incomplete. Some potential leads were dismissed too quickly, deemed improbable or irrelevant. Detective Thorne, though relentless in pursuit, faced a system constrained by technology, limited manpower, and the icy grip of winter that swallowed evidence as effectively as it froze the scene. By the end of those early days, the investigation had yielded nothing concrete. The killer remained a ghost, his identity masked by circumstance and human error. In the quiet aftermath, the first cracks in the case began to appear, cracks that would widen over decades, leaving Robert Hutson's murder suspended in unresolved horror and setting the stage for a cold case that would endure far too long. Springfield awoke to whispers that clung to the winter air like frost. The town's residents, already rattled by the violent death of Robert Hutson, began to share fragmented stories, speculation that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures near the woods. Others insisted they had heard muffled cries late at night. Fear threaded through every rumor, amplifying anxiety and silencing reason. People no longer walked freely after dark, and conversations were punctuated by cautious glances over shoulders. Witnesses who might have offered key details became increasingly hesitant. Leonora Vega, the woman at the gas station, felt the weight of terror pressing down, forcing her to recant partial recollections. She knew the consequences of speaking freely, an unspoken threat that hung heavier than any formal warning. Others in the community, aware of Victor Albright's presence and reputation, chose silence, their instincts compelling them to avoid the potential wrath of a man whose influence was subtle but pervasive. The rumors, though unverified, began shaping the narrative of the crime. Fear morphed into stories of imagined danger, and those tales traveled faster than the facts. Small towns have a memory longer than cities, and Springfield's memory now carried a shadow. Each unspoken detail, every nervous glance, reinforced a collective unease. Detective Thorne, despite his dedication, found himself navigating a minefield of half-truths and deliberate omissions. As weeks turned to months, the city's collective anxiety calcified into a tense silence. The rumors were no longer just stories. They became a shield for the guilty, a barrier that obscured reality. Fear had paralyzed not just witnesses, but the community's sense of justice, leaving the case suspended in uncertainty and the murderer's shadow unchallenged. Victor Albright, outwardly calm and respectable, moved quietly through Springfield, orchestrating perception with subtle precision. To neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances, he was the reliable contractor, a man whose work and demeanor earned trust. No hint of the violent night in the woods touched his public image. He understood that appearances could be as protective as walls, and he exploited every interaction to reinforce the story of normalcy. Within the community, Victor's influence worked silently. A polite word here, a casual smile there, each gesture designed to disarm suspicion and steer conversations away from dangerous territory. Those who might have noticed inconsistencies or remembered details that could implicate Duncan or himself found themselves unconsciously silenced. Victor's reputation acted as a buffer, shielding the family from prying eyes and unearthing inquiries. People hesitated to question a man who carried authority with ease, unsure if suspicion would bring retaliation, subtle or overt. Even law enforcement found themselves navigating his carefully maintained facade. Interviews with locals yielded polite, reassuring accounts, often unconsciously filtered to align with Victor's constructed persona. The careful layering of respectability, combined with the town's fear of retribution, allowed him to manipulate both perception and attention. Every potential lead was neutralized before it could take root. Victor's manipulation was not overt coercion but a quiet, enduring strategy. He ensured that every witness, every neighbor, every casual observer, would subconsciously reinforce the narrative he had built. The Albrights were upright citizens, untouchable, and uninvolved. And in that manipulation, the truth of Robert Hutson's murder receded further into shadows, leaving the investigation stymied and the community unknowingly complicit in preserving decades of silence. The trail of Robert Hutson's murder was littered with fragments that led nowhere. Investigators uncovered minor hints, objects out of place, inconsistent statements, faint impressions in the snow, but each clue dissolved under scrutiny. The frayed orange extension cord, once thought to be a potential breakthrough, yielded nothing conclusive in 1988. Its ordinariness, paired with the limits of contemporary forensics, rendered it nearly useless. A silent mockery of the effort poured into the investigation. Detective Thorne, determined yet constrained, pursued every lead with rigor. Interviews were conducted, locations revisited, and theories tested. Yet each avenue collapsed, either due to lack of physical evidence or the careful erasure of details by those involved. Small witnesses recanted, partial recollections faded, and the subtle manipulations of Victor Albright obscured the paths that might have revealed the truth. What remained were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that refused to assemble. Every dead end carried weight. Each failure deepened the collective sense of frustration and helplessness, not only for law enforcement but also for the town that had watched innocence fracture in the frozen woods. The absence of resolution allowed fear and suspicion to fester, ensuring that the memory of Robert Hutson's murder lingered as a question mark over Springfield, rather than a closed chapter. By the time the investigation officially went cold, the case had transformed from a tangible search for justice into a historical wound, frozen and unhealed. Clues lay buried, obscured by time, snow, and the deliberate interference of those determined to conceal the truth. The killer's shadow stretched across decades, leaving a community in quiet despair and a detective haunted by the knowledge that some crimes would not be solved on his watch. Despite the tireless efforts of Detective Thorne and his team, Robert Hutson's murder became a case frozen in time. The combination of environmental challenges, limited forensic tools, and a community paralyzed by fear created an insurmountable barrier. Snow had erased footprints, the extension cord offered no traceable DNA, and witnesses, silenced by intimidation or uncertainty, provided only fragmented accounts. Each factor alone was manageable, but together they formed a wall no investigator could breach. Victor Albright's careful manipulation amplified the difficulty. His outward respectability shielded the family from suspicion, while subtle threats ensured that those who might speak hesitated. Every potential lead, every rumor, and every partial recollection was filtered or suppressed before it could be acted upon. Even Detective Thorne, diligent and perceptive, found his efforts undermined by forces beyond his control. The case, meant to unravel the truth of a brutal crime, instead became a mirror reflecting the limits of human knowledge and the power of fear. Compounding the obstacles were procedural shortcomings inherent to the era. Forensic science in 1988 could not recover the microscopic evidence now seen as critical. Technology to extract DNA from fibers, analyze trace evidence, or cross-reference distant familial relations simply did not exist. Small missteps, delays in interviews, and overlooked details, each seemingly minor, accumulated over weeks, leaving gaps that would never be closed without the intervention of future innovations. By the end of that first year, the investigation had ceased to progress. The case officially went cold, leaving Springfield with an unresolved horror and Robert Hutson's death suspended in the town's collective memory. For 36 years, the truth remained locked away, buried beneath layers of fear, manipulation, and human limitation, until a new generation of investigators would return to uncover what had been deliberately concealed. Decades had passed since the frozen woods claimed Robert Hutson's life, and the city of Springfield had moved forward while the murder remained unresolved. In 2024, the Springfield Police Department established a dedicated cold case unit, staffed with younger investigators, armed with technology that the original detectives could only have imagined. At the forefront was Detective Ariel Jensen, a methodical and relentless investigator, whose reputation rested on her ability to see what others missed. She treated each file as if the crime had happened yesterday, not 36 years ago. The Hutson case, long locked in a climate-controlled archive, was brought to her attention as part of the unit's mandate to revisit unsolved murders. Jensen approached the file without sentimentality, focusing on evidence, inconsistencies, and every fragment of information preserved from 1988. While the original investigation had stalled on technical limitations, Jensen saw opportunities hidden in the very same details that had once frustrated her predecessors. The frayed orange extension cord, previously deemed ordinary, now offered the potential for answers that had eluded justice for decades. The decision to reopen the case was met with mixed reactions within the department. Some officers, loyal to the original detectives, worried that tampering with old evidence could yield nothing but disappointment. Others, frustrated by the cold case status, were eager for a breakthrough. Jensen's meticulous review inspired a cautious optimism, driven by the confidence that modern forensic science could finally illuminate what had been intentionally or inadvertently obscured. As she prepared to submit the critical evidence for advanced testing, there was a quiet, palpable anticipation within the unit. Every item, no matter how insignificant it had seemed in 1988, now held the promise of revelation. For the first time in decades, the possibility that the truth could finally surface began to feel real. The frayed orange extension cord, once dismissed as an ordinary household item, became the centerpiece of a renewed investigation. For decades, it had sat quietly in evidence storage, its potential unnoticed. In 2024, Detective Jensen recognized it not as a mundane object, but as a possible vessel carrying microscopic traces of the killer, an echo of the violence that had claimed Robert Hutson's life. Every fiber, every twist in the cord, held a secret that modern science could finally uncover. The unit sent the cord, along with other collected items, to a specialized state laboratory capable of extracting touch DNA from even the most degraded evidence. The process was painstaking. Lab technicians, equipped with cutting-edge technology, worked under intense focus, carefully scraping the inner loops and knots where skin cells might have been trapped. Each day passed with a tension that mirrored the frozen moment in 1988, when Robert's final struggle had taken place. Small fragments of genetic material emerged, almost imperceptible, yet brimming with significance. Jensen reviewed every step of the testing with a hawk-eyed intensity, aware that a single breakthrough could crack open decades of silence. The forensic team, equally cautious, handled the material with respect bordering on reverence, conscious that the past and present converged on this one fragile cord. The notion that a microscopic remnant could reveal a murderer who had walked freely for 36 years was both staggering and terrifying. Finally, the lab reported the results. A partial DNA profile, male, remarkably preserved despite the decades of storage. It was not a complete match, but it provided a thread thin, yet undeniable, that could link the crime to someone connected to the original investigation. In that moment, the silence of the cold case was broken, and the haunting question of who had ended Robert Hutson's life now had a tangible, living answer waiting to be confronted. The partial DNA profile, once a faint whisper of possibility, now screamed a truth no one had anticipated. Detective Jensen and her team waited with bated breath as the laboratory completed the comparison, cross-referencing the newly extracted sample against local databases and known suspects from the original investigation. When the results arrived, disbelief rippled through the cold case unit. The DNA matched a familiar name, one that carried decades of community respect and a carefully constructed public image. Duncan Albright. Duncan Albright, 52 years old in 2024, had spent the intervening years as a local contractor, a man admired for his contributions and untainted reputation. No one would have suspected that the man who had walked freely for decades was the one whose genetic fingerprint connected him to a murder long thought unsolvable. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who had worked on the case decades earlier were both vindicated and stunned. The truth, long obscured, had finally emerged, and it was more unsettling than any of them could have imagined. Jensen reviewed the original files with renewed intensity. Every lead, every clue, every subtle inconsistency took on new meaning under the light of this breakthrough. Duncan was not just connected to Robert Hutson. The evidence now suggested he was the individual who had handled the cord, the one responsible for tying Robert's hands during that final, violent confrontation. It was a stark reminder that the passage of time had not erased culpability, only delayed accountability. The implications extended beyond the department. Springfield itself was on the verge of shock, the quiet streets suddenly carrying the weight of a decades-old secret. This was no random act of violence. The death of Robert Hutson was deeply personal, rooted in envy, resentment, and a chain of choices that had been hidden in plain sight. The city's understanding of that night in 1988 would never be the same. As the revelation sank in, Detective Jensen began to reconstruct the events of that night with new clarity. The partial DNA match to Duncan Albright transformed decades of speculation into a tangible, horrifying reality. Every overlooked detail, every hesitant witness statement, now aligned with a single, undeniable conclusion. Robert Hutson's death had been targeted. This was not a random act of violence. It was intensely personal, fueled by resentment, envy, and a volatile mix of youthful impulsiveness and inherited aggression. Jensen traced Duncan's interactions with Robert in the weeks leading to the murder. The poker games, minor disputes, and simmering tensions were no longer trivial. They were the backdrop of a calculated confrontation. The detective realized that Duncan, then 18, had acted in a moment of unrestrained rage, the outcome magnified by his inexperience and emotional volatility. His father's influence, the shadow of Victor Albright's temper, had shaped Duncan, but the decision to act violently was his own. Within the cold case unit, the revelation brought both shock and grim determination. Officers understood that decades of fear, manipulation, and silence had allowed the crime to remain hidden, but now they held the tools to confront the truth. The personal nature of the murder heightened the stakes not just legally, but emotionally for everyone involved. At this pivotal moment, Jensen addressed the audience directly through the story. Before proceeding further, it was a reminder of the human cost behind every unsolved case. And if you're captivated by these intense stories and want to follow each chilling twist, consider subscribing so you don't miss the full journey to justice. Share your thoughts and tell us in the comments how would you respond if a hidden truth like this surfaced in your community. The morning of the arrest was heavy with tension. Officers from the Springfield Police Department, guided by Detective Jensen, approached Duncan Albright's home quietly, but with absolute precision. Every step, every knock on the door carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions. When Duncan opened the door, his expression shifted from casual curiosity to a flash of confusion, and then to dawning terror as he was confronted with the reality he had spent 36 years trying to bury. Jensen presented the evidence with calm authority. The partial DNA match, the historical files, the connections to Robert Hutson's death. Duncan's face drained of color. His hands, which had built a respected career and a life of apparent normalcy, trembled as he realized that no facade could withstand the force of modern science. For years, he had been shielded by the combination of fear, secrecy, and time. But now the truth had a tangible voice, and it demanded acknowledgement. The arrest itself was swift but emotionally charged. Duncan tried to protest, his voice shaking, words stumbling over one another as he attempted to explain, to deflect, to regain some sense of control. But every attempt failed. The officers remained unyielding, their duty clear, the evidence irrefutable. The man who had walked freely for decades was now confronted with the consequences of a crime that had long haunted a community and a family forever changed by violence. Even as he was led away in handcuffs, Duncan's mind raced. The weight of what he had done, the years spent hiding, and the realization that the secret was no longer his alone, crashed upon him like a tidal wave. For the first time in decades, the carefully constructed world he had built began to shatter in real time, and the truth of Robert Hutson's final night could no longer be denied. Once inside the precinct, Duncan Albright's composure crumbled. The years of suppressed guilt, the fear of discovery, and the weight of a single violent night decades earlier collided, leaving him raw and exposed. He sank into a chair, head in hands, trembling as the reality he had avoided for decades finally took shape. Memories of 1988. The confrontation with Robert, the chords, the desperate rage flooded back with a clarity that had eluded him in all the intervening years. Detective Jensen watched quietly, understanding that this breakdown was both a confession and a reckoning. Duncan's attempts to rationalize his actions faltered Under the relentless scrutiny of the evidence, every excuse, every justification he had clung to dissolved in the stark light of truth. He murmured fragments of apology, words half-formed, meaningless against the enormity of what had been done. The tension in the room was thick. The air seemed to vibrate with decades of buried fear finally surfacing. Duncan's breakdown was not just emotional, it was psychological. The careful identity he had cultivated, the life of respectability and control, fractured instantly. Years of denial and avoidance collided with the undeniable proof in front of him, leaving a man trapped between his past and the consequences that could no longer be postponed. The precinct's silence, punctuated only by the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of fluorescent lights, accentuated the gravity of the moment. In that crushing, intimate moment, Duncan understood that the truth had finally caught him. No amount of fear, secrecy, or inherited protection from his father could undo the collapse he now faced. The years of living a double life ended here. The carefully maintained barrier between his private guilt and the world's knowledge of his crime had disintegrated, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone with the consequences of that fateful night. News of Duncan Albright's arrest rippled through Springfield like a shockwave. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues were stunned, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the revelation of a decades-old murder. Invitations were rescinded, contracts suspended, and casual conversations were replaced by whispers of disbelief and betrayal. Duncan, once a respected contractor and community figure, found his reputation disintegrating almost instantly. At home, the consequences were no less brutal. Family members, caught between loyalty and revulsion, faced a reality that was impossible to ignore. Relationships strained under the weight of decades-long secrets, trust eroded by the revelation that one night had rewritten an entire life. Duncan's parents, who had sheltered him and maintained the family's public image, were confronted with the impossible. The truth had escaped every attempt at concealment. Work, social life, and public perception collapsed in unison. Projects he had managed with precision and dedication were halted, his professional credibility shattered. The community's faith in him, built over years of visible service and engagement, was replaced by suspicion, anger, and an insistent reminder of the past. Every familiar street, every handshake, every smile was now a measure of judgment rather than camaraderie. As Duncan absorbed the full scope of the consequences, the psychological toll intensified. His carefully curated identity, the image of control, decency, and respectability, unraveled before his eyes. He was no longer the man he had believed himself to be. He was the son of a violent legacy, the executor of a long-hidden crime, and the architect of his own downfall. The weight of exposure, compounded by public outrage, left him reeling, helpless, and acutely aware that nothing in his life could ever return to what it once was. The streets of Springfield buzzed with disbelief. Cafes, grocery stores, and local gathering spots became impromptu stages for shock, anger, and sorrow. Neighbors who had once waved to Duncan Albright now whispered about the decades-old secret that had lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary town. Families who had known Robert Hutson remembered his smile, his meticulous nature, the life stolen from him, and the horror returned with fresh intensity. Local media seized on the story, broadcasting the arrest with both precision and emotional weight. Interviews with longtime residents painted a town grappling with the painful intersection of memory and truth. Friends of Robert expressed heartbreak and a sense of justice long delayed, while others questioned how a man could live freely for so long, shielded by fear, secrecy, and a carefully crafted reputation. The collective shock was both visceral and enduring, a reminder that crimes, no matter how well concealed, leave a mark on every person connected to them. As the public digested the revelation, a tense silence lingered over Springfield. Conversations turned to speculation. How much did Victor Albright know? What other truths had remained hidden? And, perhaps most chillingly, how many lives had been subtly shaped by fear, avoidance, and long-buried guilt? The town's innocence, fractured decades ago by the brutal murder of Robert Hutson, now faced the added fracture of knowing the truth and the identity of the perpetrator. Yet, even as the community absorbed the shock, Detective Jensen knew that the story was not fully complete. One more piece remained, hidden in the shadows of the investigation, waiting to surface. And when it did, it promised to upend everything once more. Victor Albright sat in the sterile interrogation room, his posture rigid, his expression calm, almost unreadable. Decades had honed his ability to maintain control, to project authority even when the walls were closing in. Detective Jensen watched him carefully, aware that beneath the composed exterior, fragments of truth might still leak through. The room was quiet except for the faint scratch of pens on paper and the subtle hum of the ventilation system, each sound magnified in the tense silence. Questions were precise, deliberate, designed to unsettle without provoking outright aggression. Where were you on the night of January 13th, 1988? Jensen asked, her voice steady, betraying nothing. Victor recited his alibi with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man used to scrutiny. He emphasized details, naming neighbors, times, and mundane events, creating a web that appeared airtight. Yet, in the briefest flicker of his eyes, Jensen caught the shadow of a memory, perhaps guilt, perhaps calculation that hinted at more than he admitted. Detectives pressed gently, revisiting past encounters, patterns of behavior, and his relationship with Duncan. Each question was a probe, seeking to expose the subtle influence he had exerted over the years. Victor remained outwardly cooperative, but every measured response carried the weight of someone skilled at evasion. He guided the conversation, framing narratives that obscured rather than revealed, giving enough to appear transparent while hiding the core truth. By the end of the session, it was clear to Jensen that Victor had known more than he was willing to disclose. His control over events in 1988, over Duncan, and over the perception of those around him, was extensive. While he had not confessed, his silence spoke volumes. The investigators were left with a chilling understanding. The man sitting before them was far more involved than decades of investigation had ever proven. Looking back, Detective Jensen began to see the invisible threads Victor Albright had woven through Duncan's life. It wasn't just fear. It was a quiet, insidious guidance, shaping decisions, steering impulses, and instilling a loyalty that bordered on obsession. From the moment Duncan reached adulthood, Victor's influence had been constant, a shadow in every choice, every confrontation, every secret kept. The murder of Robert Hutson, once seen as a lone act of youthful rage, now revealed itself as part of a carefully controlled dynamic orchestrated behind the scenes. Through interviews and revisiting old records, patterns emerged. Victor had taught Duncan to absorb intimidation and convert it into compliance. Arguments, punishments, and threats, never overtly violent but precise, were administered in ways that conditioned Duncan to follow instructions without question. It was subtle, almost invisible to outsiders, yet the impact was profound. Each poker debt, each minor confrontation, and each altercation with Robert Hutson had been manipulated to create tension, pushing Duncan toward the fateful night. Even decades later, Victor's reach was evident. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers recalled moments when his words, tone, or presence shifted situations without anyone recognizing the manipulation at the time. The Albright family's reputation of respectability masked a legacy of control and silent coercion. Every decision Duncan made, every secret he carried, every hesitation during his confession, bore traces of a father's hand guiding the outcome. Detective Jensen understood that uncovering Victor's influence was crucial. It reframed the murder not as the impulsive act of an angry teenager, but as the result of decades-long psychological engineering. The investigation now had to account for the orchestrator hidden behind the scene, the man whose calm authority had driven a chain of events that culminated in Robert Hutson's death. And yet, the final chapter of Victor's story was still waiting, poised to shock both the town and the investigators alike. Duncan Albright's voice trembled as he began to speak, fragments of a long-buried truth spilling into the interrogation room. The years of silence, fear, and repression had built an invisible wall around him, and now that wall was cracking. I tied him," he admitted, the words barely above a whisper, yet each syllable carried the weight of decades. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his eyes, once guarded, now betrayed the anguish that had consumed him for over 30 years. Detective Jensen leaned in, listening intently, allowing Duncan to unburden himself at his own pace. He described the chords, the struggle, the chaotic panic that had overtaken him that night. Every detail was jagged and incomplete, revealing both his guilt and his terror. It became painfully clear that the physical act of restraint, the orange extension cords wrapped tightly around Robert Hutson's wrists, was entirely Duncan's doing. The confession was raw, unpolished, and laden with regret, exposing a young man overwhelmed by fear and anger, far beyond his maturity at the time. Yet, when pressed on the final moments, Duncan faltered. His eyes darted away, voice breaking under the weight of what he had held back. I didn't finish it," he stammered haltingly. The confession revealed a staggering duality. The act of tying Robert had been his, but the blow that ended the man's life had come from someone else. The room was heavy with the tension of an unfinished truth, the kind that left both detectives and the audience suspended between revelation and horror. In that moment, Duncan's admission reshaped the narrative. He was no longer the sole agent of violence, yet his guilt was real, palpable, and lifelong. The confession illuminated the psychological chain linking father and son, manipulation and impulse, and set the stage for the ultimate devastating revelation, the hand that had delivered Robert Hutson's final, fatal strike. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a chilling clarity. While Duncan's hands had bound Robert Hutson, the fatal act, the blow that ended his life, was delivered by Victor Albright himself. The realization hit Detective Jensen like a physical force. The patriarch of the Albright family, the man who had guided and controlled his son for decades, had ensured that the crime reached its lethal conclusion. Victor had not merely influenced events from the shadows. He had intervened directly, the hand of a calculated adult, finishing what fear and anger had begun. Records, interviews, and subtle inconsistencies from Victor's past aligned with the timeline of Robert's death. Patterns of his presence, motives, and ability to manipulate the young Duncan revealed a methodical orchestration that spanned years. Each interaction, every threat, every carefully planted word of caution or intimidation had led to that single night when Robert Hutson's life was violently cut short. It was an act of control and finality, the ultimate expression of a man who had perfected the art of silent dominance. Duncan, still trembling, could only nod as the detectives filled in the remaining gaps. The orange cords, the panic, the initial struggle, all his doing, but the fatal strike was Victor's deliberate choice. It was a revelation that reframed the entire narrative. The teenager's act was a fragment, a symptom, while the true violence originated from the father's hand. Before justice could fully reach him, Victor Albright died unexpectedly. The man who had orchestrated, manipulated, and ultimately killed, escaped arrest and legal reckoning. The final truth remained unpunished in court, a haunting echo of decades-long secrecy. Springfield could acknowledge the perpetrators, yet the full weight of accountability had been denied by death. The revelation left the community reeling, justice delayed, justice incomplete, but truth finally revealed. For Robert Hutson's family, the arrest of Duncan Albright brought no celebration, only a hollow echo of the justice that had eluded them for 36 years. Vivian Sterling, his fiancée, sat in quiet reflection, her hands trembling over a faded photograph of Robert in happier times. Each wrinkle on his face, each faint smile captured in that still image, was a reminder of what had been stolen, a lifetime of shared mornings, quiet evenings, and the mundane joy of ordinary life. The holidays were hardest. The empty chair at the table, the silence where laughter once lived, all underscored a grief that had never truly abated. Robert's parents carried their own burden. Every birthday, every milestone, had been met with absence and unanswered questions. They spoke of the torment of uncertainty, of the sleepless nights spent imagining scenarios of what could have been. Each passing year had cemented a silent, aching void, a void that no arrest, no confession, and no DNA match could ever fully fill. Their anger and heartbreak were intertwined, a mix of sorrow and long-denied outrage that finally had a name to anchor their grief. Neighbors and friends, too, revisited memories. The man they remembered, the quiet draftsman, who brought life to buildings with precise strokes of his pencil, was more than a name in a cold case file. He was a part of the community, a figure whose life, though violently cut short, had left an indelible imprint. His absence had been a shadow over Springfield, a constant reminder of how swiftly safety could turn into tragedy. And yet, amid the sorrow, there was a sense of relief. The truth, at long last, had emerged. For the first time in decades, Robert's family could confront the reality of what happened, acknowledge their pain openly, and begin the slow, tentative work of healing. Duncan Albright's courtroom appearance was tense, the weight of decades pressing down on every line of his face. The man who had once been an impulsive, fearful 18-year-old now sat as a 52-year-old confronting the full measure of his actions. The judge's words rang clearly in the hushed room, a combination of legal precision and moral reckoning. As the sentence was read, the gravity of the decades-long secret finally sank into the room, leaving silence in its wake. Duncan's remorse was tangible. Tears traced lines down his face as he listened to testimonies recounting the life he had stolen from Robert Hutson and the lives he had indirectly scarred through his father's influence. Each word, each recounting of the night in January 1988, chipped away at the wall of defense and denial that had protected him for so long. He had spent years carrying guilt alone, a silent burden now exposed to the scrutiny of law, press, and community. The community's reaction was a mixture of shock, anger, and a strange, reluctant empathy. Some were satisfied that justice, however delayed, had been delivered. Others wrestled with the tragedy of a life gone astray under fear and manipulation, recognizing the young man who had acted under the shadow of his father's control. Duncan's sentencing marked an official reckoning, but the emotional toll reached far beyond legal parameters. Amid the courtroom tension, Detective Jensen watched silently. The case that had begun as a decades-old cold file had finally yielded clarity, but it also revealed the psychological depth of family influence and unresolved trauma. Viewers, reflecting on the slow unraveling of truth, are reminded justice is rarely simple, and the cost of silence is measured in decades of pain. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect. Comment below on how fear and loyalty can distort judgment, and subscribe to witness more cold cases revealed through relentless pursuit of truth. Even in death, Victor Albright's influence lingered, a shadow over Springfield, and a silent architect of fear. The man who had molded Duncan's actions, shaped his decisions, and instilled a relentless obedience left behind more than memories. He left a blueprint of control. Neighbors recalled the outwardly respectable contractor, a man involved in community projects and local charity. Yet beneath the calm exterior, his presence had dictated the lives of those closest to him. Victor's legacy was measured not in accolades but in the psychological chains he had bound around his family. His manipulation had crafted a reality where Duncan's guilt and fear were inescapable, compelling the young man to shoulder responsibility for acts both his own and those orchestrated by his father. Friends and associates, when asked, reflected on subtle coercions, warnings, and the unspoken rules Victor enforced. A man whose word could bend the behavior of others without a single, overt threat. The town, too, felt the residual weight of his shadow. Conversations that once skirted danger now revealed cautionary undertones. The fear he had seeded in life persisted even in his absence. The ripple effect of Victor's control extended beyond the Albrights, touching neighbors, co-workers, and even law enforcement, leaving a city long wary of subtle intimidation. In examining Victor's life, the chilling realization emerges. His death did not erase the harm. The trauma he planted endured, shaping choices, silence, and fractured trust. While Duncan faced legal consequence, Victor's full moral and emotional toll remained untouched, an unrepentant legacy of manipulation and control. The murder of Robert Hutson had been the apex of a lifelong pattern, but the poison Victor sowed lingered, leaving a haunting imprint on every life entangled in the Albright name. The full weight of the tragedy settled over Springfield like a long, unbroken winter. Decades of fear, secrecy, and violence had left lives fractured, ambitions unfulfilled, and hearts scarred beyond repair. Robert Hutson's absence had created a void that neither the arrest of Duncan nor the death of Victor could ever fill. Every milestone he would have celebrated, every dream left unrealized, became a silent testament to a life stolen too soon. Duncan Albright, though facing justice, carried the invisible scars of decades-long guilt. His youth, overshadowed by his father's relentless control, had been consumed by fear and remorse. Even now, the emotional weight threatened to eclipse the relief brought by his sentencing. For the community, the tragedy was twofold: the violent act itself, and the decades of manipulation that allowed it to remain hidden. Families and friends grappled with a complex mixture of anger, sorrow, and a reluctant understanding of human fragility under pressure. The quiet tragedy extended to the subtler consequences: missed opportunities for intervention, unspoken warnings ignored, and a network of silence that enabled harm to persist. Lives were irrevocably changed, the psychological ripples reaching far beyond the immediate victims. The story of Robert Hutson was no longer just a cold case. It became a cautionary reminder of how unchecked control and fear can reshape the course of multiple lives. As the community reflected, viewers are invited to consider the fragility of trust, the costs of silence, and the enduring impact of violence that extends far beyond its immediate moment. The human heart, though resilient, bears the weight of these truths, carrying the pain of what was lost, the lessons learned too late, and the haunting echo of a life ended in the cold. In the quiet that followed, Springfield carried the memory of Robert Hutson like a shadow that refused to lift. Streets, once bustling with ordinary life, now seemed etched with the weight of loss and fear. The arrest and sentencing had brought facts to light, but they could not restore what had been taken, nor erase the decades of silence that allowed violence to fester in the dark. The truth had arrived, but it was a bitter gift, one that reminded every resident that justice, even when served, often comes too late. Duncan Albright's life, irreversibly altered, stood as a stark warning. Years of fear and manipulation had led him down a path that could not be undone. His remorse was visible, his guilt undeniable, yet the consequences were heavier than law alone could measure. For the town, for Robert's family, and for all who had felt powerless in the face of unchecked violence, the story was both a closure and a haunting. Victor Albright's absence in the legal reckoning lingered like a final, unspoken sentence. The man who had orchestrated, manipulated, and delivered ultimate harm escaped the courtroom by death, leaving the community with an unfinished ledger of accountability. It was a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous truths are those left unpunished, their echoes reverberating through time. And so, as the snow melted over Springfield streets and life continued, the story of Robert Hutson remained etched in memory, a caution, a lament, and a testament to resilience. His name would endure in whispers, in reflections, in the enduring recognition of a life extinguished too soon. The city, the family, the witnesses, and the community had faced the worst of human frailty, yet in remembering Robert, they honored the unbroken spirit of a man who, even in death, demanded truth. And in that remembrance, the final line resounds: some secrets die with time, but some, like Robert Hutson, refuse to be forgotten.